welcome everyone to the latest in our Morecambe Bay Sunset series, which we've been running right the way through the winter. We started back in the autumn when 7 o'clock actually was sunset, which obviously now it isn't. But we were talking just before about how lovely it is in a way that we can do this by Zoom, especially on such a grim evening. I don't know what it's like where you are, but it's been pouring with sleet for most of the afternoon here. And actually, it's a lot more comfortable sometimes to do something like this from the comfort of our own homes, where we can have a drink and a blanket or a comfy sofa or a bit of food, and actually listen to some the latest in a really a fascinating series of talks on a wide range of subjects, all to do with Morecambe Bay. So just a quick reminder, although I can see so many familiar faces that I know a lot of you don't need it, that really these grew out of a way for Morecambe Bay Partnership to keep in touch really with our supporters. Initially, of course, with COVID, we weren't able to deliver our events in quite the same way, and you'll know that Morecambe Bay Partnership really specialises in kind of interactive events, whether it's community archaeology projects or citizen science, or involving people in learning about the waders of the bay or protecting them. So yeah, this is, our supporters and our volunteers are a real part of Morecambe Bay Partnership, as well as the staff. So this was a way of delivering some kind of events program, but I think increasingly they've been a way really for us to keep in touch with each other, and still feel like the community of Morecambe Bay Partnership, I guess, which is all of us who have been on these talks. So I'll just do a couple of introductions. So as well as myself, I'm Tom. I'm the chair of Morecambe Bay Partnership. So I'm a volunteer myself. We've also got Claire Bradshaw, who is the Archaeology and Heritage Officer. So she will also be, this is her kind of specialist subject as well. We have Susanna, who's the Chief Executive, and we have Michelle, who is, as well as leading on our community work, is the team lead as well for many of the project officers. But the main person you need to know about is Kevin Grice, and Kevin describes himself as a community archaeologist. So this for him is a passion. It's a labour of love. He's based near Kendal, but he's been involved in lots of different archaeological projects, both for Morecambe Bay Partnership and for other organisations and community groups. So if there's an archaeological question that you have and you don't know who can answer it, Kevin's your man, I think. So specialising in solving various historical mysteries, this wonderful place that we call home. So Kevin, I understand that this is a talk you've given before, but the straw poll as we were joining suggested that we hadn't heard it before. So we're really looking forward to it. I can actually see Warton Crag from the end of my road. I've been there a lot, and this is definitely one of the top questions, I think. Is it an Iron Age hill fort or isn't it? Because I've heard both things, and we're really looking forward to finding out more. So over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Yes, it is nice to be able to do this from the comfort of my own study, rather than going out into the lashing rain that at the moment is bashing against the window over to my left. When I got involved with this project back in 2015 as part of the H2H, the Headlands to Headspace work, I didn't know a lot about Warton Crag, but I did know that it was going to be a nice, easy place on which to do archaeology. And as you'll see there, that's roughly how a lot of it looks. So it's a very straightforward site in terms of archaeological investigation, and easy to navigate your way around, as we'll see as we go through the talk. The other thing I did know about it was that it was going to be a fairly straightforward question to answer, because everybody knew that it was an Iron Age hill fort. because there was a leaflet available which said it was. So that was not going to take me very long. In due course, however, I found out that there were two problems with that definition. The first is that it wasn't Iron Age, and the second is that it wasn't a hill fort. So it required a certain amount of further investigation to try to answer the question that had been posed, whether it was or was not. A little bit of scene setting, if I may, for those who don't know the area or perhaps haven't visited it for a long time. That's a recent ordnance survey. Carnforth is just off to the bottom. That's the West Coast main line, that's the A6, and that's the other railway line eventually going round to Silverdale and to Barrow. And Warton Crag, very obvious, you can see it from the train or from the road, and the hill fort is pretty well on the top of it, shown on the ordnance there with the three ramparts that we're going to talk about quite a lot tonight. One of the difficulties with Warton Crag is that a lot of people have interests in it. You can see there from a little map that there's part of it that's county council, part of it's that's RSPB, part of it's city council, Lancashire Wildlife Trust. Some of it is Leighton Hall, managed by other organisations. So a lot of people have an interest in the land and in what's there. And that has caused, I think, some tension in the past between perhaps the archaeology and the ecology. As an archaeologist, I don't want to diminish the ecology. It's very important. It's a special place for flowers and for butterflies. And you can see there a variety of the flora and fauna that you can discover on and around Warton Crag. But it has caused difficulties. There's a couple of pictures of work that was done on the crag in 2018 in relation to the butterfly rides. And you can see there that there are difficulties then with the archaeology. And on the right, you can see this pathway there running across. And the hump that you can see in the middle of it is actually across one of the ramparts that may or may not form part of the hill fort. So there's always been this tension between the different scientific backgrounds in terms of the crag. And I felt sometimes, though it's a personal view, that perhaps the archaeology has been trumped by the ecology at times, which has made investigation a little bit difficult. Other creatures also have an interest in the crag. There we find Mum and the kids, because in the quarry below, there was for some time nesting peregrine falcons, although unhappily not for the last couple of years. So we've all had to be very careful with what we can and can't do in relation to the work on the top. The site, however, for those that haven't been up there, is fantastic. Described in the Victoria County history as a perfect position on a prominent limestone hill. There's a couple of the views looking across to the Pennines and down the coast. And we have to bear in mind that this view hasn't always looked the same. There's the view out towards the bay today. And there's an attempt to show what the sea level might have been in the prehistoric times. I think probably what it really does show is why I failed O-level art. But there's no doubt that at times during the prehistoric, the sea came much closer to the base of the crag. And I think it's important to remember that when one's looking at why it might have been used and what it was used for at different times. The level of vegetation has also changed significantly. You can see from those old postcards that very often in the early 20th century, your view would not be obstructed in the way it is now by all the heavy vegetation. And it's really only in the 1950s, after it stopped being grazed, that it developed the appearance that it has today, as on the slide that I showed you right at the very beginning. So it's important to bear in mind how things have looked in the past, because they're not necessarily how they will have looked today. But nonetheless, that's a view of one of the ramparts. While we were doing this work as part of the H2H project, we discovered that the White Cross Archaeology Group, led by John Trippier, had also been undertaking some survey work up on the crag, and happily we were able to work together with them, and they fed some of their work into us and vice versa. And that's one of the better shots of one of the ramparts. And above the ranging pole, there is actually one of the volunteers there. You can see, even at a comparatively short distance, it's not a very easy place to see what's going on. And identifying the ramparts is therefore at times really quite difficult. So what I did was to start looking at various documents to see what they might be able to tell us about the crag and what was on top of it and how it might have been used. And I started, as one would expect, with maps. I looked then at some antiquarian sources, some modern sources, and then we're going to look at the LiDAR that was done. I'll explain a little bit about that when I get to it. And there's the Ordnance Survey, which is obviously a good starting point. But here, even the Ordnance Survey is less helpful than you might hope for, because the 1848 Ordnance, which is on the left, only shows an inner and part of the outer rampart, as you can see there. By 1913, all three ramparts are shown, and indeed there are three ramparts, as we will see, as was shown on the ordnance that we've got now. So it is difficult, even from good survey maps, to identify precisely what is there on the ground. And the reason for that has perhaps become obvious with the change in the topography. So going to the antiquarian sources, we come to the first of my heroes, which is William Hutchinson. William Hutchinson was an antiquary. He was funded by George Allen, who was a solicitor in Newcastle. Hutchinson was in Barnard Castle most of the time, and they were both fellows of the Antiquarian Society, and therefore we are fortunate that communication between them have been preserved. And we can see there that Hutchinson wrote in 1788 a letter to George Allen describing his visit to Warton Crag in July of 1785. And he talks about a conversation he had with Robert Gibson and with a gentleman called Jenkinson, who ran the seminary at Yelling. And we know that he was talking to the right people, because Jenkinson was the landowner at the time. He's named in the Yelling Conyers enclosure. And also, we know that Jenkinson was, the landowner. Gibson was the lord of the manor. And we found out that he was involved with the copper prospecting at the time. So Hutchinson was talking to the right people. And what he did was really quite unusual. And he sets out in this letter that when he went up onto the crag, he was shown two urns which had been recovered. And I've set out, because it's a little difficult to read on the screen, on the left, what he says was shown, and that they were placed in the centres of a circular cairn of a conical figure composed of pebble stones, secured in a small enclosure made of flat stones set on edge, forming a coffer. And the mouth of each urn was covered with a small flat stone, and the coffer with a large blue flag. And Hutchinson thought that they were possibly druidic, certainly attributed to their British ancestors. But modern archaeologists have interpreted this as a Bronze Age cairn, possibly a barrow cemetery, which may be one of the features on the plateau. And there, in the leaflet that was produced after the project was completed, is how a Bronze Age burial may not have looked at the time. And Hutchinson concluded his letter to George Allen by describing the walls and the apertures that he'd seen, but he only paced the distances out. He didn't measure anything. And he also attempted this rather odd bird's eye view of the crag, which led to, I think, a very unfair dismissal of his account of what he'd seen. And this is the bird's eye view that he drew. And you'll see there's a number of features that he identified. The first is the urn in question. And unfortunately, the urn that I've just been talking about has been lost. And one of the purposes of doing these talks in the last few years is that if anybody's got the urn, we'd be very pleased to see it and to see what might have been in it, because it would be, I think, very helpful to identify that. There are two other features which I'll come back to in due course, a circular feature and a squarer feature on the top of the crag. But the main thing that he identified was this rather unusual arrangement of apertures or openings in the three ramparts in question. And at this time, of course, there would have been much less tree cover, so he'd been able to get this sort of clearer view that he described. Well, other people had a look at this. I'll run through fairly quickly. Dunham Whitaker in 1823 described two circumvallations or walls round a fortress which was abandoned. And Lewis in 1833 described the site as Roman. Very, very rarely will any archaeologist say that he's certain about something, because it's always possible or probable or less likely or more likely or whatever. But one thing I am certain about, I have to say, is that this site is not Roman. Victoria County History had a look at it, Farrer and Brown Bill, 1908. Again, you can see there a number of the ramparts shown in part, the inner one rather better, the outer ones rather less so. But interestingly, they describe finding in the inner wall these chambers within the thickness, and also some hut sites or enclosures. And they themselves pointed out that the middle rampart was less evident and that the alignment appeared different, and that's how it's drawn in that plan. Ford Johnston drew a rather less satisfactory plan, 1962, where you can see, again, these enclosures built within the walls. And the interesting thing from Ford Johnston is that he was an ethnologist from Liverpool University. And he was one of the first people to comment on this reuse of Bronze Age sites in the Iron Age, which is something I think that is quite important when looking at Warton Crag. But his plan drawing perhaps left something to be desired. And then we come to the second of my heroes, which is Robert Pedley. Robert Pedley did a PhD thesis at Durham University in 1939 on the Brigantes, a study in the early history of the North Pennines. And although it was never published, it is fortunately available on the Durham University website, having been digitized. And it's, I think, perhaps the most accurate description of the site prior to the 21st century. And you'll see the references for Warton Crag. He refers to Hutchinson, he refers to Whitaker, the Victoria County History, etc., as well as Jackson, to whom I'll come in a moment. And the observant of you will note that this is page 520 of the PhD thesis, all long typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, in days when if there was a mistake on a page, you had to type it all again. And those of us that have been brought up with word processors perhaps don't appreciate how difficult it must have been to produce PhD theses of this type in the pre-war period, as Pedley was doing. But he gives a very detailed description of the site, as I say, probably the best description of it before the 21st century, and concluded that halfway down the right-hand page, page 524, that this was a defensive position in relation to a large garrison, and he thought that the summit was eminently suitable for such a purpose. And he concluded that the site was Brigantian. And I'll come to the Brigantes in a moment, but basically he's therefore saying Iron Age, 1st century AD. And he referred then to Dog Hole's Cave, which is also an important part of the story, because it was excavated by Wilfrid Jackson, who was the assistant keeper of Manchester Museum in the Edwardian period. And he spent most of his summer holidays over a number of years excavating caves on Warton Crag, particularly dog holes, but there are other caves as well, and then writing up his reports. And Dog Holes is just over half a mile west of Warton Crag. And Jackson found significant evidence in Dog Holes of a whole range of creatures, elk, Irish elk, Siberian vole, Arctic lemming, from the Pleistocene area, as well as some Bronze Age pottery from about 2000 BC. So there was significant evidence of the use of the crag, in particular the cave on the crag, over a long period of time, up to and including the Bronze Age. But he also found, written up in the later journal, finds from the 1st to the 3rd centuries, which are set out in the report in terms of things like combs and other domestic items. And those are now in Lancaster Museum and some are in Liverpool Museum. So again, there's a history of use of the cave over a long period of time, up until including the early 1st century AD. He also found about a score of human beings represented by the bones, an animal assemblage which has now been lost. He thought these were Neolithic, but some dating has been done. And again, it suggested that these are Bronze Age in origin, and a repeated sepulchral use has been suggested. So there's a body of evidence about the use of the crag, particularly the caves, over a long period, up to including the 1st century AD, which brings me to the Warton sword. You can do a whole lecture about the sword itself, but it's in the British Museum. It's an iron sword with a bronze pommel and a copper alloy sheath. Even where it's found is shrouded in some mystery. The British Museum database says it was, and I quote, found under a heap of stones at Wootton or Warton near Lancaster, and it's labelled accordingly. But the Lancashire County Archaeology record says it was simply found in the neighbourhood of the fortress. It's been dated to what's known as Latin 4, which is 45 to 125 AD, though some people think it might be earlier. And wherever it was found, whether it was at Warton, whether it was nearer to the fortress, or it was in the fortress itself, it must have been connected in some way with Warton Crag. It seems to me to be far too much of a coincidence for a sword such as this to have been found in the neighbourhood, dating from the 1st century AD, which is the time of the Brigantes. And there is evidence from elsewhere of swords either being deposited ritually, for example, under stones, as well as in rivers, or of course it may simply have been lost at the time. But it's a very high status object, which is why the British Museum were happy to accept it and display it. There's the sword pommel from Brough, in the middle of the catalogue from Tully House, made by a Celtic or native non-Roman craftsman. And that's what it will have looked like when it's intact. That's probably the best example in the country of a Brigantian sword. Comes from Sedbergh in County Durham, again in the British Museum. So a little word about the Brigantes. We know quite a lot about the Brigantes from a variety of sources, starting with Ptolemy, about whom I think Bill Shannon is going to talk to you quite extensively next month. But Ptolemy produced a variety of maps showing where the Brigantes, for example, were, and those can be then reinterpreted against modern topography, largely based in North Yorkshire, but certainly came over into Lancashire or Cumbria, as we would now call it. And we know a lot more about the Brigantes because of the work that's been done by Colin Hazelgrove and his team at Stanwick, which is near Richmond in North Yorkshire, which they argue may well have been a late Iron Age royal site and possibly the capital of the Brigantes when they were ruled by a queen called Cartimandua, to whom I will come in a moment. So the fact that a Brigantian sword was found on our side of the Pennines is not entirely surprising, because it was certainly well within their realm of influence. It also gives me the opportunity to show depictions of ancient Britons. There's one from 1573, but perhaps more controversially from 1590 is this picture of a warrior queen. And this is undoubtedly a reference to people such as Cartimandua, Boudica and the like, because a number of tribes were ruled by queens during this period, and Cartimandua was quite important. And Hutchinson, that's the same Hutchinson's I talked about earlier, in his History of Cumberland, wrote an introduction about the Brigantes, which I've put on the screen, but I'll use a slightly greater enhanced text to enable you to see it, because what he wrote, I think, is quite wonderful. In those days, it was no disgrace to the bravest people to be governed by a woman. Disgustful effeminacies had not then contaminated the sex. The fripperies and insignificances of the female accomplishment were reserved to a very distant age. Even men inured to indefatigable labours and toils, constantly in arms, subsisting chiefly by warfare or the chase, and bred up to feats of valour and simple rules of native honour, were not ashamed to be led to battle by a woman. And Cartimandua was undoubtedly a remarkable character. She was queen of the Brigantes from somewhere around 50 AD for about 20 years. She ruled initially with her husband and then overthrew him for her equerry, who she made co-ruler as well as her lover. And she decided to cooperate with the Romans after the invasion and make the Brigantes effectively a satellite of the Roman occupiers. And here's a depiction by William Hamilton of Cartimandua delivering Caractacus, who was another tribal leader who she betrayed, to Ostorius, who was the Roman governor. Well, inevitably, this sort of double dealing and betrayal didn't last. The Romans put their foot down and on the march north conquered the Brigantes. There's a tablet which is in Tully House. I apologise for the poor quality, but I couldn't persuade the curator to take it out of its Perspex case to let me photograph it. But it shows a Roman cavalryman with sword in hand and a Brigantian dead or dying at his feet. And in the 70s, as the Romans marched north, this was the fate of the Brigantes. As far as Cartimandua is concerned, it didn't end well. According to Tacitus, she was taken away. She went to Chester, to the Roman fort there, and was never heard of again. So I think one has to conclude that she probably didn't survive the encounter. It's important, I think, to look at Warton Crag in the context of other sites around Morecambe Bay. There's Warton Crag. You can see there a number of other earthworks at Castle Head near Lindale, the Hode, obviously outside Ulverston, Skelmore Heads at Urswick, Stone Close, and such like. And there are another of other possible sites as well. Helsfell, near where I live, Kendal Castle, but in particular, Castlesteads, or the Helm as it's known, just outside Kendal, because there was a hill fort there that was the subject of investigation by Dan Ellsworth, who many of you probably know from Green Lane Archaeology in Ulverston. And Dan and his team concluded that Castlesteads on the Helm was a multi-phase site, began with a timber palisade in the Bronze Age, or possibly earlier, and then construction of outer ramparts in the early Iron Age, and then smaller earthworks with hut circles in the later Iron Age or Romano-British period. So a multi-phase site with a timeline that it seems to me may be very similar to that to be found at Warton Crag. Historic England had a look at this, Marcus Geacock and his team in 2017, and concluded that what was clear to them was that it was not an Iron Age hill fort, nor an enclosure constructed with defensibility as its main consideration. And they suggested perhaps a meeting place or a stock centre, and suggested that it had been constructed and used in the final centuries of the second millennium BC, so around 1200 to 1000 BC or such like. In support of their argument that they quoted as an analogy a site called Garden's Edge in Derbyshire, which I visited. And I'm afraid I have to say, with all respect to Historic England, that I don't think it supports the analysis that they put forward. There are similarities. It is a site on the edge of a crag. It has a rampart. But as you can see from the plan, it's a single rampart. It's a very different type of site to Warton Crag. And I think to argue that because you can date Gardam's Edge, you can also date Warton Crag, it is not necessarily correct. So, what investigations were we able to do? Well, as part of the funding for H2H and the Warton Crag project, we were able to commission some LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which, as I'm sure a lot of you know, enables you to have a look at sites like Warton Crag, stripping away the vegetation so that you can actually see what's underneath. And here are two views, what's called the digital terrain model, one looking north, one looking southwest. And you can see the quarry beneath the crag there, and the ramparts. To some extent, the inner rampart is obviously the clearest, but there are the other two there to be seen as well. And it gives you an opportunity to try to assess on a very difficult site like Warton Crag, what is there underneath the trees and the brush and such like. And David Ratledge has done an enormous amount of work using LiDAR in the Northwest and beyond to identify these sites. And if you want to occupy yourself, have a look at the YouTube channel that David has done that shows the site of a number of Roman roads going through various valleys in the Lancashire and Lake District. It's quite fascinating. So there's the LiDAR, which gives us an opportunity to look beneath and then draw from that some form of plan of interpretation of what this may have looked like. And that's Historic England's interpretation of Warton Crag. And a number of things I think are obvious. The first is that the hollow, which Hutchinson mentioned, is there, and it might have been a dew pond, because one of the problems with Warton Crag is whenever it was occupied and by whom it was occupied and why it was occupied, there's no natural water supply. There's no spring up there at all. So whoever was there would have needed some form of water. It would be difficult, but not impossible, to carry it up. But obviously a hollow such as that, if it was a dew pond, would have helped. The other thing that I think is clear from that is that the middle rampart is undoubtedly different. It's thinner, it's on a rather different alignment. And that led me to wonder whether all the ramparts were actually built at the same time. And there's a schematic plan. The red boundary is the scheduled monument, and then the three ramparts are shown with various datum points to indicate where various observations were taken. Happily, the conflict that I mentioned earlier was resolved to a large extent by a conservation management plan in 2018, which attempted to reconcile the interests of the various landowners with the ecology and such like. And that happily has produced, I think, a much greater degree of cooperation between everyone than might perhaps hitherto have existed. So, a reappraisal of the site. This is my view. It's not anybody else's necessarily, but it seems to me to make some form of sense. I think the site was used in the Bronze Age, if not the Neolithic. It may have been a hilltop enclosure. The obvious parallel in Cumbria is Carrick Fell, which was a causewayed enclosure dating from the Neolithic period. But certainly Warton Crag, I think, must have been in use in the Bronze Age. What's the evidence for that? Well, there's Hutchinson, as I mentioned, with the Bronze Age urn and burial. The related finds in the associated caves that Jackson identified. And putting it all together, a Bronze Age use seems to me to be, I think, unarguable. If so, I think it was probably along the line of the middle rampart. A single small rampart in the middle makes no military sense. You don't have a large rampart, then a small one, then another large rampart if it's defensive, which suggests that it probably was at that time used for other purposes, perhaps for burial, and perhaps repeated use, as Ford Johnson suggested, from the Neolithic ancestors. Expanded then by the Brigantes as a lookout, at least, it commands the sea, but also very much the land between the crag and Ingleborough over to the far east, and would have been undoubtedly a very useful lookout for the Brigantes. The Romans were never interested in it. The Roman road goes significantly to the east. So if it was used in that period, it must have been by the native Britons. Evidence would therefore suggest that the outer and the inner ramparts, the two more defensive ramparts, the two more substantial ramparts, were built in the 1st century AD. And that would be evidenced by the finding of the sword, which undoubtedly dates from that period. And Jackson again finding 1st century AD material. The one Roman find that Jackson identified is explained by Pedley as having been the product of a raid by the native Britons, as a result of which it came back as booty and not indicating that it was a Roman site at any point itself. And that would give a timeline not dissimilar to Castlestead's, which is only about 12 miles away as the crow flies. A Bronze Age use, then developed in the Iron Age, and then further developed in the 1st century AD by the Brigantes. And the leaflet has within it this representation or artist's impression of how it may have looked during the Bronze Age. Grateful to John Hodgson for that. It shows the 3 ramparts, if I'm wrong about their time of construction, and a settlement on the top. I don't think one could take it as too accurate, but it does give some indication of what it might have looked like. So where do we go from here? Well, Historic England are undoubtedly right in saying that the date of the monument will only finally be determined, if at all, by excavation. And that's not going to be easy for obvious topographical reasons. There is an argument that core sampling might assist. It's been done on hill forts elsewhere to take down through the various layers to see if you can identify datable material from different ages. But beware anyone that wants to metal detect, because it's an SSSI and you're not allowed to metal detect. Funding was being sought when everything came crashing down because of COVID. But I again make the plea, if anybody wants to assist, we'll be delighted to hear from them. Until then, we go back to Hutchinson, because I think something very important can be derived from Hutchinson, dismissed for many years in his account of the crag. I think we need to pay much greater attention to what he found. Not only because when he looked at it in the late 18th century, there was very little vegetation, very little tree cover, and therefore he would have had a good opportunity to have a proper look at it, but because of what he actually identified. That's, just to remind you, what Hutchinson drew, this rather unusual bird's eye view, which he couldn't possibly, of course, have had. Even from a balloon, you would not be able to, I think, draw something like that in 1785. So it was very much done from what he saw as a part of his imagination. But that's what he identified. And that's the LiDAR from 2016, if you simply turn it upside down. And I think it's important and illuminating to put these alongside each other, because that's Hutchinson in 1785. And that's the LiDAR in 2016. And I think that demonstrates that we need to look at Hutchinson very much more seriously than we have. A postscript, very briefly, the project, I'm happy to say, with the White Cross, got one of these Angel Awards from Historic England. So if nothing else from it, I do have a piece of paper on my wall signed by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Acknowledgements to everybody that participated. Some I know are listening tonight. Thank everybody for their assistance, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. We've got a few people using their applause buttons on their screens, and I've got the very disconcerting experience, I don't know if you had that, Kevin, as well, of the computer writing everything I'm saying, so I need to be a bit careful. Yes. I'm just going to have to ignore it, I think, put my hand up. Good. So
I must say, Tom, that the voice type that they're using, the software, is actually rather more accurate than the one I use, and I think I'm going to have to borrow it.
It's very good, except for local place names and historical terms.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell. Great. So we do have a few questions. We've definitely got room for more. as well. There's lots of thank yous coming up, Kevin, as well, so you can have a look out for those. So I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up, and then we'll sort of end by opening up the mics, maybe, if people want to speak. So comment here from Sonia. You haven't mentioned the 2 Bronze Age burial mounds on the hill overlooking Leighton Hall, which is only a mile or less away, and that also points to a Bronze Age presence in the area. They do sound similar to the one described on Warton Crag.
I agree. I haven't mentioned them. I assume your question is referring to Summerhill. I'm a little bit dubious about some aspects of that site, I have to say. I've heard various people explain it and talk about it to me. If it is Bronze Age, then it, as your questioner says, it is certainly very adjacent, and it is certainly supportive of the Bronze Age use of that type of hilltop. I didn't mention it because I think there are perhaps some issues with those sites that I didn't really want to get into because I was talking about Warton Crag. But if they are what they say they are, then I agree it's supportive. But I'm not necessarily placing a lot of reliance on them myself.
And can you just clarify, it's on a similar topic, when you showed that diagram near the end of the Bronze Age settlement, basically with little houses and stuff on the top, when you're talking about Bronze Age enclosure, you are talking about settlement rather than just kind of an area for gathering stock and what have you.
That's what we're talking about. Yes. Yeah. I mean, here we're talking about both. I think the evidence that it will have been for stock enclosure is much stronger than it is for the settlement itself. I think the illustration that's now on the screen is a little bit exaggerated from that point of view, because I think it will undoubtedly have been seasonal. I can't see that people will have lived up there in the winter, even in different climate, partly because I said that the lack of water supply. So I think, as with other similar sites, I think it will have been used seasonally, mainly as stock enclosures. But there is sufficient evidence of huts and such like to show that at least for some part of the year, people were living there. But I'm not sure that you could extrapolate from that they lived there all the time. And it seems to me to be probably unlikely.
Great, thank you. And then the other question that we had, I'm going to just expand on a little bit because I picked up on something on one of your slides. So we had some questions about the tree growth.
Yeah.
And those really stark slides, there are similar ones of Silverdale as well, and Arnside Knott, just showing that very sort of sheep grazed, very kind of naked summit. But you also showed a slide from 1848 where there's a woods on Warton Crag clearly described as Strickland wood and Potts wood.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit more about what we know about the history of woodland and kind of when the trees came and went on
yeah,
Warton Crag?
I mean, there was undoubtedly some natural woodland, I think more on the slopes than necessarily on the top, because of the windswept nature of the site. There was also some cultivation of woodland, if you like, some planting, coppicing and such like, done in the 19th century. I think the felling of timber largely stopped by the Second World War, as did the grazing. And that's when the tree cover that we see now really took over. And anybody that knows anything about the life history of older and trees like that will know it doesn't take very long for a site to completely disappear under that sort of tree growth if it is left unchecked. And it was only comparatively recently that people started to cut down or manage that in a way that enabled areas to be seen. But the point that I was making was that that was rather done for ecological purposes, for butterfly rides and such like, without regard to the archaeology. So what was covering the archaeology was largely left, which is why we've got the problem that we've got today.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good, we've got quite a few more questions coming in. I'll try and do them in a logical order rather than necessarily in the order that people are writing them. So there's a question here at the bottom from Richard. How tall would you expect the ramparts to have been? And are there any full-sized ones left?
Right, how tall? I've got the dimensions somewhere of what is actually left, if I can just have a quick look at the note. I think at their highest, if I remember right, they're about 5 feet. They will have been higher than that originally. And there's undoubtedly been some degree of scatter as they have fallen away and broadening of the base of the ramparts accordingly. But I would have thought probably about 6 feet or so. On Castlestead, Dan Ellsworth estimated, I think, that the original wooden palisade, which was put up, was somewhere in the region of 7 or 8 feet. You wouldn't, I think, find it easy to put a wooden palisade up on Warton Crag, just because the nature of the limestone into which you'd be trying to fix the wood. So it may well have had to have been stone from the beginning. And I think that suggests it probably would have been not as high as it would have been if you could build it up in wood. But something of that order. In terms of ones that are left, there are a whole range of hill forts from different eras. The best known, I'm sure, is Maiden Castle. But there are a lot of ramparts that are still in existence. And the lady from Liverpool University, Rachel Pope, did quite a lot of work on a hill fort in North Wales. And what she was able to do, which is what you'd love to be able to do on Warton Crag, but which is impossible, is to actually cut through a section of one of the ramparts on the hill fort in North Wales. So effectively, you got a cross section through it from top to bottom, which then enabled you to identify how it had been built up in different layers at different times and to find some dating material. And that again showed, if I remember right, that it was in use over hundreds of years and was slowly built up or rebuilt by different people at different times. But there are quite a lot of hill forts still in existence. The Oxford University project, which tapped into Warton Crag, amongst other things, produced an atlas of hill forts. I don't know how many there are. Do you know, Claire, how many hill forts there are in England? There's an awful lot. And some are in much better states of preservation than others.
Not off the top of my head, but there, yes, a huge number. Oh, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, about 1,200 apparently.
Oh, there you go. There we are. Right.
I'll come on to Stephen's question actually. So Stephen, who answered that question, he says he's from the White Cross group and they've recorded the site. He says there's nothing left on Warton Crag higher than about 4 feet. Yeah. And even then only in a couple of places.
Yeah, that's my recollection of it.
Yeah.
But clearly, as I was saying, there will have been tumble as the ramparts slowly decayed. They will have fallen off the top to the side, so they're now, in a sense, fatter and wider than they would have been originally.
Yeah. And then a question on a related theme from Rob. Are the ramparts made of stones, like one of the slides you showed? Or were they earthworks or both?
No, they're all stone.
Yeah,
they're all stone. And the reason for that is just because that's the material that's available. Anybody that's been up onto Warton Crag will know that there is very little soil there that you could actually use, and certainly nothing like turf or anything like that. So unlike the hill fort in North Wales that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, where there's an awful lot of grass and turf available that you could utilise, on Warton Crag it would have to be stone. Otherwise you'd be carrying heavy weights a significant distance to be able to build the ramparts up in anything other than the natural limestone that was under your feet.
So we have a comment, really more than a question. We're just drawing some interesting parallels. Audrey, who's from Virginia in the States, just makes a parallel with some of the US Civil War ramparts. And she says they're considered ancient there, but they're from 1861 to 1865. but it is fascinating, given that they were also using swords in the American Civil War. That they're effectively using the same technology and the same battle style as 2,000 years earlier. It's amazing, isn't it? Really.
Yeah, I think the Gatling gun actually changed that somewhat.
Yeah. But until then. Until then, we were effectively fighting each other in the same way. Okay, we'll move on slightly from ramparts then. I think this is probably the next question to go to, from Jan and Ian. So on the bird's eye diagram, there was the circular thing and the squarish thing. These are technical archaeological terms, I know. So we think now from your talk that the circular shape was the dew pond that you mentioned.
Could have been, yeah, certainly.
But what was the theory for the squarish one?
Square thing may well be one of the huts. As we can see, there were various huts built into some of the ramparts themselves, but actually on the top there was evidence that there may have been some occupation, or it might be the residue of the burial.
Yeah.
It's not sufficiently precise, as you can see on the screen. It's simply a rectangle drawn on the top of the crag. So we don't precisely know what it was that Hutchinson was intending, but it could well be the residue of the burial. And there certainly is evidence that the burials would have taken place in that sort of cemetery during that period.
Yeah. Thank you. So the next question. Is there any possible context with the Langdale axe found in Yelland? I mean, we know, don't we, that Morecambe Bay was being used as a trading route. Because I know there have been sort of Langdale, the tuff, isn't it? The volcanic tuff that they made them out of has been found at Heysham, and there's the kind of routes across. So can you say a little bit more about what was happening then, maybe with the Langdale axe factory and the trading routes?
The Langdale axes, of course, are much earlier than the periods I'm talking about. There is an interesting theory that was espoused by a lady called Denise Kenyon, who did a PhD on this at Manchester, and then it became a book. And she attributes the origins of Warton Crag to a lookout, but not in the military sense, but a lookout to preserve the trading route for the Langdale axes down the littoral, down the coast of Cumbria, and then round into the bay. Not a lot of other people have ever gone with that, and I didn't mention it because I'm not myself persuaded that it's right. But if you can take Warton Crag back to the Neolithic, then you might be able to sustain an argument that it had that function, or might have had that function during that period, because it would then coincide with the Langdale axe transportation period. But if you regard it as Bronze Age or later, then obviously that's after the Langdale axes, and that argument falls away. So you've got, in a sense, to make the double argument, you've got to take it back to the Neolithic, and then you've got to tie it in with the Langdale axe trade. Denise Kenyon thought you could do that. I've never been persuaded about it, and that's why I didn't mention it. But it is a possibility. And if you could date the site to the right period, then that would be an obvious reason to use it.
But there haven't ever been any Neolithic findings then, actually, on the crag itself?
Only in the caves.
In the caves, yeah.
Yeah, in dog holes, I say you can date some of that back to the Neolithic, but not on the crag itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it will have been used over a long period of time, because it's an obvious refuge and it's a wonderful lookout. Whether you could then extrapolate from that it was anything to do with the Langdale axe trade, I think is rather more dubious.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So it brings nicely, I think, onto Bill Shannon's point, and Bill is doing another talk later on in our series, which I'll come to in a minute, and I'll do a bit of an advert for some of our future talks. But Bill just says that it's perhaps worth mentioning that the name Warton means guardhouse or lookout place. So that is fascinating, that both the lookout that you were mentioning from the early Iron Age and some of the theories about Bronze Age use and possibly even earlier, that history of it being a lookout. And he says that there's also early modern evidence for a beacon on the site as well.
Oh, that's right. I mean, I certainly, in the sort of the slightly longer version of this talk, I have got the map that Bill very kindly alerted me to in the British Library, the Cecil map, which I think is what Bill will be talking about, which does show that there was an Armada beacon on Warton Crag. I left it out, partly for reason of time and partly because it doesn't actually help with the question that I was looking at, which is the hill fort. But there was a beacon there, and undoubtedly, again, utilising the lookout potential for that reason.
Yeah. So, couple more. You might have to explain a little bit more about the brothers, but it says, question from Bob, are the brothers standing stones accessible from the crag summit?
Ooh, I don't think they are. Stephen might have a better view on that because he's perhaps had a greater opportunity to walk over it with the White Cross group. I don't know, but I don't think so.
No, he says they're not on the crag. He says itself.
That's certainly right. They're not on the crag. I mean, you could undoubtedly get from one to the other if you tried, but I don't think they're directly connected as such. I stand corrected on that.
Yeah, okay.
That's my recollection.
I've not heard of the brothers before, so Stephen, maybe if you could post a little bit more about them, that would be great. So yeah, some comments coming through then about those. So the next one, going back to the Rampart Stone, have any early quarry sites been found which might have supplied the Rampart Stone, or did they just nibble away at all those outcrops of rock that you get on the top of the crag?
I think the answer to that is that they must simply just have taken what was underneath their feet. The only quarry sites that I'm aware of on the crag are all Victorian. So I don't think that helps explain, other than the fact that the ramparts are constructed of stone that is natural to the crag. So nothing was brought up, and therefore that they were simply taking what was in front of them. Yeah,
I mean, it's pretty blooming steep, the crag, depending on which side you go up it from. So it would have been a fair trek to have carried stuff up.
Easier, of course, from the north.
Yeah,
from where the road is. But even so, yes.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think that's all the questions we've got. Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you again to Kevin. Really, really good. Very good delivery as well. I think you really did make that topic come to life, both the research and the historical figures, and really some lovely insights, I think, into what life would have been like and the politics of the time and everything. Really, really great. So thank you. You're a storyteller as well as an archaeologist.